Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Before I turn it over to our panelists, Spencer Lake and Professor Thomas Philippon, I wanted to cover a couple of quick housekeeping items and to share a little bit about their respective backgrounds. And I realized I should also introduce myself. I'm Audrey Campbell, Associate Director of Development at NYU Stern. So first, I just wanted to mention that we encourage all attendees to submit questions during the session. Our panelists will hold about 15 to 20 minutes of time for Q&A toward the end of their discussion. So if you have a question, please feel free to just submit it by clicking the Q&A button toward the bottom right of your screen. And my colleague Laura and I will be monitoring those incoming questions and presenting them to the panelists in just a little while. Additionally, if you're experiencing any technical difficulties with audio or video, just let us know. You can also submit those questions through the Q&A chat, and our Stern IT colleague, Martine, will be happy to respond to you privately and provide any assistance. Okay, so now let's welcome our speakers. First, our moderator, Spencer Lake, is a founding partner at Element Ventures, a UK-based early-stage enterprise financial technology VC. Over the past 4 years, he's been investing in and advising a number of tech firms. Until 2016, he worked in the banking industry for almost 30 years. And most recently, he was vice chairman of HSBC Global Banking and Markets. During his tenure with HSBC, Spencer held several global senior roles in areas including debt capital markets and acquisition, finance, global markets, and capital financing. Prior to HSBC, he spent 17 years at Merrill Lynch in senior roles spanning real estate finance, investment banking, and debt capital markets across New York, Hong Kong, and London, where he's based today. Spencer holds an MBA from NYU Stern School of Business and a BBA in Finance and Marketing from Suffolk University. Professor Thomas Philippon is the Max Heine Professor of Finance at NYU Stern. In 2014, Professor Philippon was named one of the top 25 economists under 45 by the IMF. He's been the recipient of numerous awards, including the 2010 Michael Brennan and BlackRock Award and the 2009 prize for Best Young French Economist, among many others. Professor Philippon joined the NYU faculty in 2003. Within that time, he studied various topics in macroeconomics and finance, including systemic risk, crisis resolution mechanisms, and the dynamics of corporate investment and household debt, as well as the size of the finance industry. And his recent work has focused on the Eurozone crisis, financial regulation, and the market power of large firms. He currently serves as an academic advisor to the Financial Stability Board and to the Hong Kong Institute for Monetary and Financial Research. Previously, he was also an advisor to the New York Federal Reserve Bank, a board member of the French Prudential Regulatory Authority, and a senior economic advisor to the French finance minister between 2012 and 2013. His critically acclaimed book, The Great Reversal, was published last year, 2019, and we're looking forward to hearing more about it today. So with that, I want to say welcome to both of our panelists, and I will now turn it over to Spencer.
Thank you. Thank you, Audrey. That is a daunting resume of Professor Philippon, so I'm a little bit, I'm honored, but I'm also nervous. And I will apologize before if we have sort of bad Zoom connection. Our house goes off piste a little bit of the time. First, I would say that the book is a great read. It's very easy to understand, it's relevant, and it is really painting, I think, an appropriate picture of what's happening in America as we speak, but really over the last couple of decades. You know, the good thing about irrefutable data is that it's objective. And when we have objective data, we can debate it, we can debate the ramifications, we can draw parallels to it, we can learn from it. Ideally, we can change behavioral patterns so that it doesn't continue to the extent that we think it's bad, and we can plan forward. So this book has that dynamic, and I think it was a takeaway for me. The big question marks that sort of I come away with after reading it is, the United States, has it lost its productivity? Has it lost its cost effectiveness? And I think importantly, and this book draws this out, has it lost its relative importance compared to other big economies? Probably most notably in this book, the EU, but also I think we have to focus on China, and we have to talk about China as well, because we are sort of at the tail end of a hegemonious period, which I think is quite important to understand. The other dynamic which is troublesome, I've always looked at America as having a very regenerative capacity, and that goes back for centuries, where, by definition, when something bad happens, we always pull out of it. I'm a Canadian, but I really feel quite American in many aspects. And the question that I would have coming out of this book is, have we lost that regenerative capacity? Because when we look at what the world is going through today, especially COVID-19, which is having catastrophic economic impacts everywhere, including America, what does that mean? I'll give you a couple of examples. If you look at the sort of 1980 to 2020 timeframe that the book covers, in 1918 or 1980, only 35% of firms today are young companies, those that are under 5 years. In 1980, it was 50%. Today, only 27% of new businesses are what we call, or businesses are what we call new. That's not true. In 1980, it was 40%. Actually, if you look at the listed stock market today, we have only 3,500 listed companies across all of the 14 or 15 American exchanges. It used to be 5,000 in 1980. To put that into perspective, if you look at the GDP of America during that same period of time, in 1980, the GDP of America was 2.9 trillion. Today, it's 20.5 trillion. So what does that mean? It means that you are probably 50% less firms today control an economy that is 7 times as large as it was 30 years ago. The EU today is 18.8 trillion versus 3.5, is 5.3 times larger. The other important stat to remember when America is going through this dynamic is that in 1980, China was 191 billion in GDP. Today, that's 13.6 trillion. That's 71 times larger. So America is suffering from a lack of competition. And that is a result of regulation. It's a result of lobbying. And I think probably more importantly, it's a result of political tinkering. And politics over the course of time, both in America, but also in the EU, have had a pretty dramatic effect on how companies think, how they're taxed, how they're regulated, whether they can perform. Do they perform a service for the people? Do they perform a service for their investors? What are they there for? So I think some pretty important questions that, that hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about in the next 45 minutes. But I want to pass it over to Professor Philippon because he's really the star of the show. And I guess my first question, Thomas, for you, as you arrived in the US in 1999, so you've been there for 20 years. It's the basis of that 20 years that you decided to write a book. And I would love to understand, and the audience to understand, what were the catalysts that made you think about this? And can you describe some of the economic changes that have taken place that as a result of your study or and going forward?
Yeah, thank you, Spencer. So yes, it turns out that the book covers a period of time which is roughly the time I've been in the US. That's a coincidence, but it's a striking one, at least for me. And the title of the book comes from that experience to a large extent. I chose The Great Reversal because it's kind of the experience that I've had in the US in some respect. Not all of them, we'll come back to that. So I'm still bullish on America, but I think that America has a lot of things to fix at home. And one of them is competition. And there is no better way to look at it than just take a couple of examples. So when I came to the US, like you said, in 1999 as a student to go to MIT. And, as soon as I arrived, I realized that there's tons of stuff in the US, which is cheaper than in Europe, right? So I could, of course, I wanted to buy a laptop as a student. I wanted to be able to connect to the internet from home. Soon enough, I wanted to buy a cell phone and then a cell phone plan. All of these things in 1999 were a lot cheaper in the US than in Europe, okay? And mostly that was because of intense competition in these markets. The telecom industry had been deregulated. Companies were, competing for customers. and therefore you got good deals essentially. And that was striking because, you know, the standard economic theory is the richer the country, the more expensive some non-traded goods and services are. Obviously, like a haircut in New York is more expensive than a haircut in you know, in a poor country. But somehow it was the opposite there, because Europe was poorer than the US by about 20%, still poorer than the US by about the same amount on a per capita basis. But yet it was cheaper to get, you know, cell phone connections or internet connections. It was also cheaper to fly in the US, to the point where when I arrived in the US as a student, I would not have imagined that I could just buy a plane ticket to go to Chicago to go to a conference. Right? Because in Europe, that's not how I would do it. I would have probably taken the train or driven or something like that. But it was cheaper in the US, and that was feasible. So that's the US that I knew as of 1999. It's also the US people have in mind still today, which is like the land of free markets. Now, it was not true in every market, but, you know, to make things simple, I think broadly speaking, it was the land of free market, which really means it was a good deal for consumers. And then you fast forward 20 years and you look at the same set of products, and you see the opposite. So today, to give you a sense, if you live in Paris and you want to have a broadband internet connection, you're going to pay something like $30 per month. Okay, that's the average cost for a household to get you know, high-speed broadband internet connection at home. In the US, it's $68. $30 versus $68. This used to be cheaper in the US, and now it's more than twice as expensive. And it's not just Paris, it's about the same price in Berlin, in Madrid, in Rome, in London. All of these countries are, if you compare for the same speed, same quality of service, between $30 and $40 per month compared to $70 per month in the US. Okay. So clearly something drastic has changed. And that's kind of one of the trigger of the book, which is, okay, how did that happen? And then if you follow the telecom industry, where it happened via higher markups and higher concentration. There are fewer operators, they don't compete. If you're in Washington, DC, you're stuck with Comcast. And I think people outside the US somehow just don't always realize fully. The only people who really understand are people who go back and forth, because they don't understand why suddenly when they cross the Atlantic, their cell phone bill is multiplied by 3. But people who live only in the US or only in Europe don't realize it fully. But it's shocking. Like the last time I was in Washington DC to give a talk at the IMF, you know, I asked my cab driver on the way from the train station to the IMF, how much do you pay per month for your telecom bills, right? So taxi driver, so he had internet at home with Comcast, complete monopoly in Washington, DC. And he had a cell phone, of course, as a taxi driver, you need to have a cell phone. The guy was paying $300 per month for telecom. He's a taxi driver, right? So it's insane. Now, the telecom industry is very extreme. So if you look at other industries, it's not as extreme. But broadly speaking, what I show in the book is that many industries that used to be like the hallmark of competition in the US, they've become, you know, dominated by a few big players who don't compete very hard because they don't have to, and then consumers get a bad deal. And so that reversal happened over the past 20 years, and that was the main motivation for writing the book.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because obviously America is one country. You know, it's one regulatory dynamic. It's one language, broadly speaking. And if you look at the trends within M&A, if you look at the trends within lobbying, if you look at all the initiatives, it has been to create the concept of bigger is better, because it looks at itself, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but it looks at itself as obviously one country that's competing with the rest of the world, and they want to be able to have a national force. In the EU was 28, now it's 27 countries that all have, you know, their own sort of nationalistic kind of dynamic. And cross-border acquisition activity has been kept to a very, very low level. In fact, and when things make sense, they still haven't happened. The Alstom-Siemens deal going back for a couple of years ago was just last year pushed back because it was perceived to be anti-competitive. So does the EU change? Does the US change? So you have a different dynamic in these two big economies. And you make that comparison to the EU. Does the EU work its way to the US, or what happens?
Yeah, so it's the EU and the US are interesting to compare for many, many reasons. some of them are, suppose that you noticed a change in the dynamics of some industries in the US that looks like firms have higher markups, higher profit margins, and there is more concentration. That itself does not tell you very much of what's going on. It could be that it's just the good firms, the firms that were already leading, just invested even more, became even better, so that allowed them to increase their market share. But they did it through innovation, so it's not a big deal. Or maybe they are responding to changes in technology, and the technology is such that there's just there used to be room for 6, now there's room for 5. So that's possible, and it's very hard to know if what you observe is this kind of positive dynamic driven by technological change, or whether what you see is a much more negative dynamic driven by lobbying or barriers to entry and stuff like that. And so if you only look at one country, it's very hard to disentangle these two things. If you compare two countries that have, for some industries at least, that have different regulations or different approaches to antitrust, then it becomes sometimes clearer to make the comparison. And in the case of Europe, exactly as you said, at the same time the US was moving towards less competition at home, the EU was moving in the opposite direction. And what's super interesting in Europe is that the driving force was the realization in the 1990s that the US was the place where consumers had a good deal, where the markets were working well, and therefore the US was the model to emulate, to copy. Right? We say copy is always the best form of imitation, is the most important form of admiration. If you imitate somebody, it's because you think it's doing the right thing. Well, the EU thought the US in the 90s was doing the right thing. And so when we set up the EU institutions, we looked at the US and we thought, oh, maybe that's all these things about competition and consumer welfare, maybe they're right about it. Now, the thing that's still surprising is, why did it happen? Because you could imagine very well that it could have been blocked at many different stages. Like Europe, especially, so that was not true of the UK, but the rest of Europe, continental Europe, did not have a tradition of free markets. Definitely not a tradition of free and independent regulators focusing on consumer welfare. As you said, they were much more nationalistic, national champions, let's protect them for competition and stuff like that. That was the tradition in Europe. And so somehow Europe managed to break from this tradition to adopt something that looks much closer to the American models of competition. And that happened because European countries realized.
I mean, still subscale compared to the Americans. I mean, they're tiny compared to the American competitors.
Well, it depends on which industries. I mean, if you look at manufacturing, no, not. I mean, for manufacturing, I think it's very comparable, like cars or trains or machines. That's very comparable. The only place where there is a lack of scale in Europe is, well, tech, of course, like big tech. There is no equivalent of big tech. And perhaps in some financial services, although financial services is complicated, so I think we can discuss it separately. But the key thing was that Europe realized that, well, if you're going to have a single market where all these 28 or 27 countries would be together in the same free trade zone, then it was very important for the referee to be independent. So the same countries who didn't like very much, like the French never liked the idea of an independent regulator, because the French politicians like to play Legos with firms and then have control over who buys whom and all of that. They just love doing that. And somehow, yet, at the EU level, they accepted to do something completely different. And the reason they did that is because they didn't want the EU Commission to be influenced by, say, Germany. And Germany didn't want the EU Commission or the competition authority to be influenced by France. And then all the smaller countries that are also super important, like we always think of France and Germany, but that's a misleading view of Europe. You have 28 countries or 27. All the other relatively smaller economies, they would never join a club where the referee could essentially be bought or influenced by the two big players. Why would you join such a club? So the key thing to understand is, for Europe, having an independent regulator was front and center, part of creating a single market. And then everything else followed from that. Once you created that institution, it started to enforce free markets, focus on consumer welfare. And Alstom Siemens was a perfect example of that. It was a deal that was pushed by Berlin and Paris, more so than by Paris than by Berlin, but you know. And it was a deal that was motivated by Chinese competition. And it was a deal that would have created a monopoly for signaling, plenty of train equipment. So it was a deal that was opposed by the 26 other countries because they all understood they would get ripped off. And despite heavy lobbying pressure from Paris and Berlin, the Commission said, no, it's a merger to monopoly. We don't do that, period. And I think they were completely right to do it. And and of course, now we don't even mention it that much because it was, I think it's one of these cases where it was extremely controversial, but then it was pretty obvious that they made the right choice. What was surprising is they managed to hold their ground. So I think that's what happened in Europe. And then it provides a nice, comparison to the US. Airline markets, same thing. There has been mergers in Europe. In fact, there is even some mergers that people think should not have been allowed. But by and large, we have EasyJet and Ryanair who are competing extremely fiercely with the existing airlines, and it's never been cheaper to fly in Europe than today. Well, of course, pre-COVID.
Well, I think it is. I think time will have to tell what's the right model. But again, on the nationalistic theme, if you look at, again, America today and this construct of big is better, and it's manifested itself, big is definitely there. Whether it's better or not, I guess, is the debate. But much of
it's
that,
very important. So the one thing that's here that's very important. This is new. Like the entire tradition since Teddy Roosevelt is that American policymakers have been skeptical of big is better, and they have been skeptical of business influence on politics. And in fact, that's why they invented trust busting and antitrust. It's because precisely, if you read every commentator after World War II, when they saw how the Americans were thinking about economic policy and the kind of ideas they brought to Europe, it was precisely that. They were like, big firms are fine, but you don't want a situation where an industry is dominated by a few firms. That's not good.
No, I clearly get that, but now the dynamic has changed. Actually, Europe is not even in scope really for America. It's really all about China, and China is obviously big. The United States has had a kind of 80-year run of being the largest economy in the world. We can talk about hegemony and what that means, because I think that's a super interesting sort of psychotic behavioral thing that is now implanted on America. We have to continue to be the best country, the biggest country in the world. But what does that mean? Because at the end of the day, it's a smaller population. It's, there's been no economy in the world that's had more than a sort of, I think the average is 95 years of being the dominant economy in the world. The United States is at sort of year 88 or 90 or something like that. How should one think about that when you're thinking about what needs to change in America? Not necessarily to just beat China and to be better than Europe or whatever. What needs to change in order to solve for this psychosis that seems to be overwhelming political diatribe and the way lobbying works, et cetera?
Well, I mean, as we saw in the news, of course, there's plenty of issues to fix in the US, and some are not directly connected to economics, that the way we're discussing today. Although it does have a bearing on inequality, I have to say, because if you look at the data, the households that are most hurt by monopoly rents tend to be, lower middle class. And so what I show in the book is if we could return to a competitive economy, relatively, like the median household would benefit a lot. So my estimate is that the standards of living of the median household would go up by about 10% if we return to a competitive economy, just because they would pay lower prices, and then firms would then compete more for customers and therefore also for workers. So if you add up all the pieces, That would be a very significant boost. For a median household earns about $50,000 per year in the US. And my estimate is they would gain an extra $5,000 of standards of living, of real purchasing power. So that would be a big deal. But it's not all of the issue of inequality. Clearly, competition is not going to solve the entire inequality issue in the US, but it would be positive. I think if you step back and you think about, what made America the dominating force in the world for the last century, I think it's really not that complicated. You have three main factors. You have knowledge and innovation, finance, and a big competitive market at home. So knowledge and innovation, that's still there. It's linked to private research labs, private universities, private and public universities that are the best in the world and that are pretty good at interacting, working with private research. So these are the advantage of the US in that field is still there, and I think is going to remain there for many years. The second one is the financing ecosystem, from angels to VCs to big institutional investors who are able to allocate a significant amount of money to innovation. So that's still there. There is no doubt about it. So America is still able to produce the most innovative companies, finance them. And the last piece is the big market. Now, the big market is critical for companies because, when you launch in the US, you can immediately access 300 plus million customers. And in Europe, it's true in some industries. So in car manufacturing, it's true, but it is not true in services. So I think if you, from that perspective, the US still has very strong innovative capacity, financing capacity. What it's lost is the fact that if you have competitive market, then everybody's going to benefit from it. Not just the firms are going to be innovative, but the consumers are going to get a good deal. So it's going to lift all boats. That they lost. And clearly today, shareholders are very happy, they get fat dividends, but many consumers, especially lower income consumers, get ripped off by monopolies. And that creates all kinds of resentment, all kinds of inefficiency, all kinds of poverty that shouldn't be there. But that's fixable. So I think it can be fixed. China, on the other hand, I think I'm not as bullish on China as some people are, because I really think history has shown that, private firms innovate better. Now, it doesn't mean you don't want funding by the government. There's huge funding of private research by public money in the US, as we all know. The DoD is one of the major contributors to funding research, but it's based on competitive private firms. And the success of China over the past 30 years was driven by fierce competition and innovation in the private sector. That's what made China rich. And now I think that the reverse can happen. That is, if the new line of Beijing of bringing back state control on the economy, cracking down on private entrepreneurs, if they really keep doing that, I think it's going to hurt their growth rate. And I think they're going to pay the price for that. Now, of course, it's still, there is one more than one, even if that means they're going to be 20 or 30% poorer than they would have been otherwise, they might still become the first economy in the world just because there's 1.5 billion people there. But I don't think we should think of China as a country that has rewritten the law of capitalism. I think that's completely the wrong way to think about it. What it is apply the right tools, which is private competition and innovation successfully. Okay, but this is exactly what every successful country has done. So and if they revert, I think we're going to see a reversal as well.
Yeah, I mean that could be your next book, because I think it is going to be an interesting debate. But again, when you look at America, there is at least in the administrative level a preoccupation for China, China trade wars, etc. An element of it is around the currency, which is also a question I'd like to ask you. I mean, America today, as it has forever, accounted for 80+ % of world trade. It is the currency of choice for world trade. It's a reserve currency. It has been a reserve currency for 75, 80 years, and we've had different reserve currencies over the course of time. What is the risk of that? Because it's actually not weighted relative to the size of the economy. When you go back to the global financial crisis, before that you could look at the pound and you could compare it to the UK economy and see symmetry. You could look at the euro compared to the euro, et cetera, et cetera. We trade currencies based on underlying economic value. Today, since the global financial crisis, we've lost that. Now it's traded based on where can I go to be safe? And the dollar has preserved that. Is there risk of a new digital currency coming that makes the wheels as fast to do trade, doing something else? Does the RMB, and maybe that's too far in the future, but what is the risk to the US of losing that sort of dominant position from a currency perspective, which gives it so much authority from a regulatory and other positions?
Yeah, that's a great question for policymaker. To your point earlier, I totally agree with you that people in Washington are very, it ranges from very worried to freaking out about China, and half of them for good reasons. So I'm not, there is definitely, there are good reasons to be worried about the rise in China. There's also good reason to think it's an opportunity. And the question is, how do you balance the risk and the opportunities? The idea that it's all risk is also wrong. It's risk and opportunities. But I think it sounds extremely plausible that no matter what, in the next 50 years, we are not going to have one hegemon. We're going to have 2 or 3 major countries that, or blocks that trade globally. And yeah, I think that's the future. Now, for the role of the dollars, it's one of the things that has remained, in fact, increased over the past 10 years. Before 2008, you saw the euro actually increasing slowly but surely in terms of holdings, trade invoicing and stuff like that. I think the financial crisis has revealed that the euro was not quite ready for prime time, in the sense that as a currency it was very stable, but it doesn't provide the same safe assets, because you don't have one safe debt in euro. You have to choose whether you put your money in Germany or France or Italy, and then there are spreads, and the whole thing becomes more complicated. So I think that the sovereign debt crisis in Europe has clearly shown that the euro has not delivered its promise as a reserve, as a global invoicing currency. And so by default, people reverted to the dollar. And I think the dollar is dominant today. And the main reason is that there is no competition. In the sense that there is no competitor. I don't mean that. That's what I don't mean in a bad way. I mean, like, that's the only game in town. And I don't think it's going to change anytime soon, because the Chinese financial system is not ready to have the same level of trust worldwide. The danger for the US is that I think some of their policies that underlie this dominance were set post-World War II and had been somewhat stable over time, which is more or less you're in favor of free trade, of the rule of law in international relations. And that's why the dollar became the dominant force. Now, if they really give up on that, something bad could happen of it. But I think we are pretty far from that.
Well, and the challenge that America has had, and it's manifested itself actually over centuries, which I didn't really know until I kind of researched, has the United States ever gone into default? So the dollar is that bastion of, it is the safe haven currency, and it has manifested itself increasingly since the global financial crisis of 07, 08. But the challenge that America has is that it's very leveraged. When you look at its leverage compared to other economies throughout this period of time, it's really kind of jackknifed, and it's going to probably continue to do so because COVID has been expensive, as it has been elsewhere, but America's throwing even more resources, I think, per capita than probably any other country in the world. And back in 2011, I think you and I were probably at the IMF at the same time, when S&P came out and downgraded the country. And said, listen, you are a AAA country, and you can make your own money. which is a great luxury. But the political risk in America today with a two-party system is greater than the political risk in many emerging market economies, because you can't actually agree on anything that's on a partisan basis or on a bipartisan basis. And so I think, and we can talk then about healthcare and some of the big structural issues that America has to solve that are going to cost even more money in order to solve for what has become apparent as a result of the COVID pandemic. But I'd love to get your views, on that, on that sort of political risk in America, the leverage in America, not only at a federal level, but at a state level, where you have really a credit market that exists for 50 states, that they can go bankrupt, towns can go bankrupt. And what does that mean, with that political struggle that is going to continue for what seems like a long time?
Yeah, so I think it plays out differently at the national level and at the, local governments, either state or municipalities. At the national level, for the dollar or the US federal debt and the role of the dollar and treasury bonds in the global financial system, it's mostly a game of, it's not a game of being great, it's a game of being first. It's all relative. So given that there is no alternative to the dollar, the market have no choice but to tolerate a very high level of dysfunction in Washington, DC about, global politics. And we saw it with the downgrade in 2011. We saw it with every time they played the game of the debt ceiling and the possibility of like a technical default because of the debt ceiling. If there was an alternative, a true alternative, then I think you could imagine a scenario where people would rush out and, and the dollar would crash. But there is no alternative.
But that's the question. Is there?
But the euro is not ready to be an alternative. The other ones are too small, and the only possibility would be China. But China is also not. The Chinese financial system is nowhere ready to play that role. So I think it's going to remain like that for a while. Now you could say it's bad for incentives of the politicians. That is true. It's like a spoiled child that knows that no matter how much fuss he or she makes, then it's still going to get its toy at the end because that's only game in town. So yeah, I think it's bad for incentives. I think that the US can indulge in nonsensical political debate because of that, without paying the cost. Yeah. Any other country with half the level of political dysfunction would be run over by creditors immediately. Yeah. That's the privilege of the US. At the state level, it's very different. I agree. In fact, I think one of the big challenge in designing the post-COVID exit strategy is going to be that. It's going to be, will there be efficient cooperation between the federal level and the state level? Because a lot of the spending that's going to be required is at the state level. And I think specifically for the US, the challenge is to design a federal program post-lockdown that actually transfer money to the state where it's needed. And there the politics is ugly, because of course it is true also that some states in the US have been fiscally irresponsible, specifically with their pension liabilities. And so, you don't want to bail them out because, they should clean up their own, house before getting bailout money. On the other hand, it is also true that they have COVID-related expenses that they have to cover that are legitimate. And so the question is, can you get them to spend on the COVID-related legitimate expense without bailing out their unfunded pension liabilities? That's going to be an ugly fight for sure.
So that brings up a great question that again has been bandied around Europe before, and I remember during the Greek bailout back in 2010, 2011, we were at HSBC front and center on advising on that restructuring. It didn't default, but could they default? And then how do you, if they did default, that's a 230 billion pound or euro debt stock that has to effectively somehow be solved for. Is there a debt mutualization dynamic that takes place, and all of a sudden everybody pays for someone's mistake? And in America, at the federal level, I think Reagan did a little bit of it when he was the president, but you have that now sort of facing us with states who have really big potential bankruptcy dynamics where they can't tax their way out of it. Does debt mutualization as a thesis start to creep into, how do you solve for the equation in America of very leveraged, federal, state, local government levels?
Well, hopefully not. I mean, I think that states should be allowed to go bankrupt, and I think that federal bailouts would be a disaster because it would be terrible for incentives. I think the part of the stability of the U.S. financial system was in the 1800s when it became clear. I mean, if you look at the initial investors in U.S. bond, they were totally confused. If you look at people who bought the U.S. debt after 1800, typically they didn't really understand the difference between debt issued by Illinois versus debt issued by the federal government. And it was very confused for many, many years until a few states defaulted. They were not bailed out by the federal government. And then it became very clear there is federal debt that does not default. And there is state debt, all bets are off. And I think that discipline was great for fiscal responsibility at the state level. And I think that there is no, I think to me at least, there will be no reason for the federal government to bail out state or city or anything. They need, if they have too much debt, they need to restructure that debt. That's their problem. The only trick here is that can you earmark legitimate support for the people? That's like the debt is all by creditors. If you default, that's their creditors' problem. But what you don't want is to do it at the same time as you have like massive unemployment in the state, or some people really need help. You need SNAPs, you need food stamps, you need unemployment benefit, you need healthcare for people. So that help must get to the people. But that help should not be used to bail out, creditors or unfunded liabilities at the state level. So that's where I think it's feasible, by the way. I just think that it's gonna play out. And in Europe, we're going to see the same discussion. We have somehow in Europe, we're moving a tiny bit in that direction because we are finally creating some kind of federal program post-COVID for the COVID debt, which I think is a great thing. It's not that big yet. It's probably going to be available only next year. So I think in the short term, you could still argue that the ECB is really the only game in town for Europe, at least for another year. But we are seeing the beginning, the roots of something that could depend, like a pretty good federal program at the EU level. But it's very clear the way it's written and designed that this is for COVID debt. This is for COVID expenses. It is not for whatever you did in the past.
But in Europe, I mean, again, Greece proved it. We saw it with Spain, we saw it with Portugal, we saw it with Ireland. Countries didn't go bankrupt. They were softly restructured. Federal money was created to pump down and ensure that, the maturities were extended out to 50 years or 100 years, coupons were low, et cetera, et cetera. In America, you can envision the same having to happen simply because they too will move to maybe not a negative rate environment. I mean, vast majority of Europe is in a negative rate environment. The UK now is moving to a negative rate environment. The US is low. Maybe it moves there. If that happens, number one, and then number two, you have the muni debt market in the States is what, $4 trillion. That's a very large part of many people's pension plans. When that goes negative or goes bankrupt, all of a sudden you have two dynamics. One we'll get to in a second, which is healthcare. You have a healthcare dynamic that's not paid for, and then you have a pension dynamic in a negative rate environment, which is not solved for. And so those are really two big kind of tsunamis that are kind of headed in the way of America as they then deal with this competitive dynamic. But so I'd love to hear your views on that, because that is very hard to airbrush away, I think.
I agree. But on the other hand, debt restructuring is part of life. I mean, we restructure debt all the time for businesses, for local government. Europe had a specific issue, which is because we don't have a common safe asset, the equivalent of the federal debt. That means that each country's own national debt is playing the role of the safe asset. And so therefore the decision to default on this debt is very tricky in Europe. I think where we've made progress is default on private debt, in particular financial debt. So I think we are not finished, but we've made improvement there. But I agree, right now, countries are still responsible for their own debt. I think maybe Audrey wants to move to Q&A.
Yes, yeah, thank you. I think this would be a great time to segue to Q&A. We've gotten a lot of really interesting questions, so we'll see how many we can cover in the next 15 minutes. So the first one from Pascal that I'll go ahead and pose to you, Professor Philippon, is what are the new mega trends after the COVID-19 pandemic in our business habits like working, taking meetings, travel, things like that?
So the COVID recession is in some respect similar to other recessions, and in some respect a bit different. What's similar is that it's going to hit harder smaller firms. That was true of pretty much every recession in the post-war period. Smaller businesses tend to be more fragile. They have less liquidity, less cash on hand, less access to liquidity sources outside. So they tend to die at a higher rate than big businesses during recessions. So I think that's going to play out the same way in this one. But what's different with COVID is this is likely to be particularly severe here, because the COVID recession is not at all uniform. It hits some sectors much more than others, and this sector tend to have many small firms. So there is a real challenge of many small businesses, in particular in the service sector, that if we don't do anything, we're going to have a massive wave of bankruptcy. So I think that's the main challenge going forward, is avoiding this massive bankruptcy of SMEs. That's true in every country. It's true in Europe, it's true in the US. So that's the first one. About the habits that are going to change, well, clearly we're going to be doing Zoom conferences much more than physical conferences. From my test, I think it's a great evolution. I think it's long overdue, to be honest. And I think that's going to stay. So we're going to fly less. We're going to do more Zoom. It's going to be better for everyone, for our kids and for our environment. So I'm looking forward to that. The big question is what happened to big tech? Clearly, big tech was well positioned before the COVID, and they also got lucky in the sense that their business model were the ones that were best suited to resist. And so the valuation of Amazon went through the roof for the right reason so far. So it's one cases where the reason is just because they are good at what they do, and what they do is even more useful today. I think the way I would frame it is we also have opportunities. I would put Zoom as an example if you want. Zoom didn't exist, or it existed, but like it was like a very marginal player 3 months ago. Today, it has a very high market value. It has a huge network of users who love it, and including young users who love it. So that's a base on which you can build a very significant competitor to Facebook and Google. And I hope it stays that way, because I want that market to become more competitive.
Great. I have another question that I'll pose to both you and Spencer. This is from Christine, and she says, the ESG sustainability movement made great strides in recent years. How will the economic downturn and recovery affect this trend? And how can we help companies and countries focus on long-term versus short-term goals?
You want to go first, Spencer?
Well, it's a big question. I think that, the natural corollary with what we're going through now is that natural disasters now can become a more frequent occurrence in our lives. And the environmental piece, for sure, has to play a big role in that. And you're starting to see, companies become much more cognizant of what that means and what they can do about it. But I've fundamentally believed for a long, long time that actually until we have regulation around this, and it comes down to the consumer level, it's going to be difficult to change behavior, because behavior is by definition something that's innate to you, innate to a company, innate to a country. And when I was the chairman of ICMA, the International Capital Markets Association, we created the Green Bond Principle, which is now core and not very scientific and not very specific yet, so it needs to improve upon that. But it is voluntary. And I've always believed that until there's a point at which your armband says, listen, Audrey, your carbon footprint is X and it should be Y. And if it's actually more than Y plus 10% or something like that, I'm going to make you pay a little bit more so that you change your behavior. So I think that it's a perfect time to try to segue into a much more regimented way that we treat the environment. And it's going to have to be consciously done, because I think there's really still, you have the sort of Trump, I don't believe in global warming kind of thesis, which is a complete disaster relative to what's important, which is that global warming is a big problem. So I think you have to have unanimity. I just don't know what forum there is today in a period of increased nationalism. I think that, nationalism today is unfortunately greater than it was even 15 years ago, how you get that done. But that's what I think needs to happen in order for people to really take this stuff seriously.
Yeah, I fully agree. I think that if you want to think about what's going to happen, again, you're going to have two effects. One is the fact that, unfortunately, like spending on the environment or ESG is somewhat of a luxury good. So when people are poor, they are less willing to sacrifice in order to make the economy more green. So that's going to be a cost in the short term. But there's also a huge opportunity, because this is like the most important disruption of business practices in our lifetime, by far, by an order of magnitude. So that means that you have opportunities. Since we're going to have to change a lot of stuff, we might as well change in the right direction. And so you see a beginning of that. You see airlines positioning themselves to really think about, okay, how do we make airplanes that are very significantly less, much more carbon neutral. You see that for car industry as well. So I think it's an opportunity, and I think we can seize the moment. I mean, look, who are the best performing car manufacturer in the past, in the COVID period? Tesla and Toyota, not by chance.
You know what I would also say, just one last point, and I think that this is both a plug and a plea for the money side of the equation, right? Because I grew up on the sales side. I was a banker for a long, long time. And it's always the case that if you don't have any money and you can't get money because the structure around what's required to get that money is so severe, you'll change what you need to do. And I think you've seen some amazing behavioral changes in the Nordic region, in France, big pools of money, some of the big global sovereign wealth funds who are saying, we are simply not going to invest in you unless you have adherence to some form of ESG standard. What we need is the ESG standard to be concrete. What we don't have is that. So if you can get a concrete standard that basically can really apply discipline to your carbon footprint and what that means, and you're not going to be able to borrow, get equity at all until that will solve the equation. So there's going to be a combination of regulation around the retail use, regulation around where money should go, et cetera, et cetera. That's what we need. And I think it's really time to do that. I don't think that we can wait very long on this particular topic.
Agreed.
Great, thank you both. Another question, an anonymous submission is, in light of current events, do you think the EU Commissioner for Competition is viewing large US tech companies principally as potential detriments to EU consumers or to EU companies, or both? Professor Philippon, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, that's one of the key critical topic. So let me just preface by saying that we shouldn't be too pessimistic. There is virtue in having independent regulators from different countries. And let me just give you one example. The Dieselgate scandal, Volkswagen cheating its emissions, polluting cities in Europe. All the regulators in Europe looked the other way. That was pure corruption. Okay, they all knew this was happening. Okay, and they all looked the other way. Why? Because of lobbying and corruption. And who solved the problem? A bunch of kids in the US, in some NGO, who then later talked to the California regulator. And all they did was run the test with actual driving. Now, can you just tell me that people in Europe couldn't figure that out? All you had to do was run the test while actually driving the car outside. It took it's like a trivial idea, and it was brilliant. And so thanks to this American initiative, European consumers are going to live longer, healthier life, because we are not going to be polluted by cars that cheated their emission standard. Okay, now flip that. Think about all the antitrust actions against Google, Facebook, and the big tech. Most of them not very successful, by the way. But at least it started in Europe. So we started building some knowledge about what works, what doesn't work. We know that just slapping a big fine is just not going to work. And now that the US is finally considering doing something on this front of big tech, they can look to Europe and see what worked, what didn't work. When the US finally is also seriously considering legislation on data protection and privacy, well, they didn't start from scratch. In fact, if you look at the California legislation, it's copy-paste from the EU. It's exactly the same thing. They just took the GDPR from the EU, they just added a few things and made it the California legislation. Now, this legislation, by the way, still have plenty of problems. There's stuff there that doesn't work. There's stuff there that's counterproductive. But clearly, there is learning on both sides. So that's how I view it. The big picture is, this is where we learn. Now, on the tech firms, it's still going to be the case that it's going to be tougher in Europe because we view it as an issue for consumers, and we don't have, we don't get the dividends. So if you're in the US, and these firms have too much market power, that might hurt your own consumers at home in the US. On the other hand, you get the global dividends from it. So mechanically, they're going to be more lenient. So if I was advising the US government, I would not give necessarily the same exact advice as I would for the EU Commission. I think that's fair game. But I don't think that there is, I think what the EU Commission has been doing has been extremely useful. You could say that on the tech side, they tried a lot of things. They failed many times, but at least they tried. And also the process has been quite rigorous. Like the one thing that's very important for people to keep in mind is like the way the EU Commission works is by the book, especially on these topics, not on all topics, but on this topic. There is no bias, like all the nonsense about they are targeting big tech firms because they are Americans. That's just not true. Look at the data, they are just as likely to target any firm from any country, as long as there is some proof of antitrust. So I think they should continue what they're doing, and they should focus on EU consumers. That's their job, that's what they should be doing. Now, the tricky question is what's the right thing to do? And I think that's only something that's going to be solved when the US is also entering the game. I don't think the EU by itself is going to have the tools to fix some of these markets.
Great. Let's see if we can get one more question in, and I'll pose it to both of you again. So this is from Jerome, and he asks, how do you analyze the very accommodative monetary policy over the last 10 years? And do you believe it carries risk of a substantial economic crisis? Spencer, do you want to go first?
As a non-economist, yeah, I'm incredibly qualified to do that. What I would say is that there is a difference today with the stimulus that's being put in place, because when I was in the business and money came into the system in 07, 08, 09, it was actually quite self-servedly used by the banks to solve for the banks. And I think very little got back into the real economy. When you look at the dynamic today, the vast majority is going into the real economy. And banks have had issues, but they're better capitalized, and regulation has done its trick in making sure that they have systemically not had to kind of all go in a pack to also get bailed out. So, and we'll see how that pans out, because COVID is going to play out, and there's lots of SME risk out there. But I would say that someone has to pay the piper, and I think that Thomas is probably better tuned in to figure out who's going to pay the piper here, because this is not free money. This is not helicopter money. Someone has to pay for it at the end of the day. But I think it's been done in a much better fashion this time around than it was 12, 13 years ago.
Yeah, I think I agree. I think the 2 points that are very important to keep in mind. The first one is, thank God we had the regulation post 2010 that we had. That is, we always, it's, we like to criticize or complain, but sometimes it's also good to remember the thing that we did right. And so post 2010, we increased capital requirement for banks. We made the whole system much safer. If we had not done that, if the system was as leveraged and unsafe as it was in 2008, then on top of COVID, we would have a massive financial crisis in our hands. And that would be a bloody disaster. Because right now, as Spencer said, the banks are playing actually a pretty good role in the economy. Most of the SME lending programs that the states have implemented to help the real economy, they are channeled by banks. If the banks were bust, that would not work. And they would have been bust if they hadn't had the capitalization increase that they've had over the past 10 years. That's thanks to global effort by regulators, and I think we should be happy for that. That's very important to bear in mind. The second thing is easy money. Well, it's easy money, just the fact that the economies are not growing very fast and that the real interest rate is low, that's real. That's just like, that's telling you something about the real dynamics of capitalism. The monetary policy is just trying its best in that world. I think that, clearly we need fiscal support for the economy. I think what I see happening in Europe and the US looks promising to me. So I think we're going to mostly do the right thing. There's one question mark, which is in 2008, there was no risk of inflation. And people who thought there was risk of inflation, were just massively confused. Today, it's less obvious because COVID is also a negative supply shock in some markets. And so whether, in 2, 3, 5 years, we're going to have inflation going up a little bit, it is actually possible. Now, given that we start from such a low level, I don't think it would be a disaster, but I think that's something that could happen.
Great. Well, thank you both. This has been a really interesting discussion. I want to thank everyone who joined. And just to give a couple last remarks, this has been recorded, so we will be able to distribute it to anyone who wasn't able to join today. And we look forward to seeing you again soon. But thank you, Spencer. Thank you, Professor Philippon, for your time and fantastic.
Professor. Great. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thanks, guys.
Yes, bye-bye.
Bye.